Welcome to The Explainer. Today we are tackling a really big and often misunderstood idea. We're looking at the work of historian Gyanendra Pandey to ask a fundamental question. Is the religious conflict we hear about something ancient, something that's just always been there? Or is it something much, much newer? Right, let's just dive in with the question that so many people think they already know the answer to. You know the story I'm talking about, this idea of an ancient hatred, a deep-seated, almost natural rivalry between Hindus and Muslims in India that supposedly stretches back for centuries. But what if that whole story is built on a shaky foundation? Well, this is where Pandey drops a bombshell. He says that the very word we use for this, communalism, isn't some neutral, factual description. He argues it's a modern invention, a concept, a lens that was created during the colonial period to make sense of India. And that changes everything, because it means we're looking at history through a very specific and maybe even biased framework. So to really get our heads around this, we have to look at the word communalism itself. We need to unpack it, because in this whole discussion, the definition is absolutely key.
Now here's the really revealing part about this word. Think about it for a second. When do you hear the term communalism? It's almost exclusively used to talk about conflicts in places like India, right? You pretty much never hear it used to describe, say, the conflict between Protestants and Catholics in Northern Ireland. And that selective use, that's a dead giveaway. It suggests it was a label created by colonial powers to frame conflicts in certain parts of the world as somehow uniquely primitive or religious.
So back in the colonial era, you'd basically had two huge and seemingly opposite stories that were being told to explain all this conflict. Let's take a look at how they both tried to make sense of it. On one side, you have the colonialist take. Their story was that India was, by its very nature, just a messy collection of warring religious groups. And for them, the idea of a single, unified Indian nation was some foreign Western import that didn't really fit. But on the other side, you had Indian nationalists arguing the complete opposite. They believed a unified nation was India's true destiny, and that communalism was this ugly, backward-looking political problem that was getting in the way of freedom. But here's the twist, and this is where Pandey's argument really clicks. He points out that both sides, the colonialists and the nationalists, made the exact same mistake. They both started from the assumption that the Hindus and the Muslims were these solid, finished, unchanging blocks of people. They saw them as already built communities, just waiting for the next fight. But Pandey asks the killer question. What if these communities weren't the starting point at all? What if they were the end result of a process? Okay, so if you're going to argue that a community identity is built, you have to show how it's done, right? So let's get concrete and look at a really powerful case study of how this actually happened on the ground.
So how was it done? Well, in this case, it was through an incredibly powerful, emotional, and highly organized campaign, the cow protection movement that swept across North India. And let me tell you, this movement was about way more than just cows. It was about building a new, widespread Hindu identity from scratch.
The whole thing was powered by what were, for the time, new tools of mass communication. This thing you see here is a patiya, which is basically a circular letter. And these things were passed with incredible speed from village to village, almost like a viral message before the internet. They carried these really urgent, emotional messages that defined the common cause, a common threat, and a common duty, literally binding thousands of scattered people into a single coordinated force.
And look, this didn't just pop up out of nowhere. It was a slow burn, built methodically over decades. You can see how it ramped up. Started with these small societies in the 1880s, then it caught fire and spread into a real mass movement. And then, boom, it exploded into widespread violent riots, first in 1893, and then again, even bigger in 1917. This was an organized campaign, plain and simple.
And the organizers got really good at this. They basically developed a remarkably effective and repeatable formula for getting thousands of people fired up and ready for action.
In fact, they developed a clear four-step playbook. It's almost like a recipe. First, you send out the call to action with those viral patiyas. Second, you give everyone a powerful unifying symbol, the sacred mother cow. Third, you light the fuse by spreading rumors of an immediate threat, creating a sense of crisis. And finally, you get to the action. You gather huge armed crowds and send them off for a confrontation. It was literally a factory for producing outrage.
And the propaganda was anything but subtle. Just listen to this description of a picture they used. It's so direct. It visually defines us, the holy cow, literally filled with Hindu gods, and them, the evil demon butcher. It takes a complex social situation and boils it down to a simple, mythic battle of pure good versus pure evil. And the result of all this organizing was staggering. In 1917, the violence in just one district was so widespread that the colonial officials themselves, in their own internal reports, were calling it a civil war that covered 150 square miles. We're not talking about a small street brawl here, not by a long shot.
But here's where it gets really interesting. If you could have actually looked inside those massive Hindu crowds, you wouldn't have found a simple, unified mob. You would have found something much more complicated.
You see, when you look at the court records from the time, the rioters weren't a monolith at all. It was more like a coalition of the unlikely. You had powerful upper caste landlords, the local big shots, kind of leading the charge. You had large groups of cultivating castes who were the muscle of the movement. And then you had these wandering holy men who gave the whole thing a stamp of religious approval.
And everybody had their own reasons for being there. For a lot of the lower caste groups, joining in was a strategic move. It was a way to climb the social ladder. By protecting the sacred cow, they were doing something seen as ritually pure, which was a powerful way to stake a claim to a higher status in the Hindu social order.
But for the upper caste leaders, the motivation was totally different. For them, it was about power. In a world where colonialism was shaking up the old social order, organizing a huge mass movement like this was a way to prove that they were still in charge, that they were still the real leaders of the local community.
And you know what? The British officials on the ground knew exactly what was going on. This quote here from a British magistrate in 1893 says it all. He's basically saying there's no way thousands of men just spontaneously showed up. He knew they were there because they were organized and led by the powerful local landlords, the Babus of Surajpur.
So let's bring it all together, because this is the absolute key takeaway. The unified Hindu community that we see acting in these riots, it didn't exist in that form before this all started. It was created, it was forged through the act of mobilizing for the conflict. It was a temporary, fragile coalition, built from different people with different goals, and it took constant work to keep it together. And what this history from over a century ago really shows us is something fundamental about how identity works. Often, it's a project. It's not always this thing we just inherit like our eye color. It's something that is actively built, piece by piece, to achieve very specific social and political goals.
And that, of course, leaves us with a final and pretty challenging thought. If a powerful sense of community could be constructed back then, with paper leaflets and rumors, it forces us to ask a really critical question about our own world. What forces are building our communities today? And why are they doing it?